The National Children's and Youth Law Centre, in conjunction with the Australian Catholic University, have created a series of videos to assist students and young people to understand their rights and responsibilities as a tenant. What are my rights and responsibilities if my co-tenant stops paying rent? Shared housing can be great fun and economical. However, sometimes it can go wrong. When you're at university, studying can be difficult without adding financial problems caused by a housemate not paying their rent. Before we begin, let's find out what kind of tenant you are. Check your lease to ensure that you have a co-tenancy agreement. If your name is on the lease and you pay rent to the landlord, then you're a co-tenant. If your name is not on the lease and you pay your rent to someone other than the landlord, you won't be a co-tenant. A co-tenancy is when two or more tenants sign the lease. Each person's name will be on the lease and they each have to pay money for the bond. If you're a co-tenant, your name will be on the bond lodgement form. As a co-tenant, you're responsible for paying the rent, some of the bond, and will also be responsible for any damage to the property. This means that all the co-tenants promise to pay all of the rent and for any damage, even if they didn't cause the damage or it's not their rent that's unpaid. Not only are co-tenants responsible to pay for other tenants' unpaid rent, but the unpaid rent also means everyone's lease is at risk, because if there's unpaid rent, the landlord can end the lease, even for those tenants that have paid their rent on time. It may not make much sense to you that you're responsible for your housemate's share of the rent when you've paid your rent. However, the law says that a co-tenant's lease agreement means that each tenant is responsible for the rent. That makes each tenant responsible for all of the rent. It doesn't matter how much each person has agreed to pay towards the rent, but this doesn't mean that you can't try and get the money back from a co-tenant who hasn't paid. This is because in addition to the contract with the landlord, each co-tenant also enters into a second contract. The first contract is the lease agreement that you have signed with your co-tenants. The lease agreement is a contract binding the landlord and the tenants. The second contract is an agreement between the co-tenants that's recognised by the law, even if you have not made a written agreement with your other co-tenants. The second contract is an agreement between the tenants to share the rent and bills between them. For example, the agreement may be to split the rent into 3, to pay the rent each week, and to promise to do these things until the lease ends. So what do you do when your co-tenant stops paying rent? We all know that sometimes it can be difficult to pay rent. You may be between jobs, your scholarship hasn't come in, or there was an unexpected budget blowout the previous week. However, when one co-tenant doesn't pay their rent, things can get messy and expensive quickly. If this happens, the best thing to do is to talk to the other co-tenants as soon as possible. You may decide to call a house meeting, or if you think that the unpaid rent is because of a personal issue, the housemates may think it's best for one tenant to speak privately with the tenant who hasn't paid their rent. This won't be an easy conversation, and it's important to try to be understanding of the other person's feelings. It may be a good idea to ask, "We noticed that you haven't been paying your rent recently. Is there a reason for this that you'd like to share?" Try to obtain a promise from them when they think that they will be able to start paying their rent again. See if you can get the tenant to tell you the amount and the dates they intend to pay. Take notes of the conversation. If your co-tenant doesn't know when they'll be able to pay rent again, you may have to make a tough decision and ask them to leave. If a co-tenant can afford to pay for the unpaid rent, perhaps suggest a payment plan where the tenant who hasn't paid rent pays the other person back over an identified period of time. it's a good idea to get these kinds of agreements in writing. But you may want to know what happens if you and your housemates can't afford to cover the co-tenant's rent if they can't pay. As all tenants are responsible for the rent, the landlord can take steps to get the unpaid rent from any one or all of the co-tenants. The tenant who hasn't paid their rent still has to pay rent because their name is on the lease. But the landlord can ask any of the tenants to pay for the late rent, even if it's not theirs. If a co-tenant can't pay, the landlord is more likely to ask the other co-tenants living in the house to pay, simply because they're easier to find. So what can you do when your co-tenant can't pay the rent? Well, there are three options. You can pay the rent yourselves, you can find a new co-tenant, or you can end the lease. Before you make a decision or take any action, think carefully about what you want to do and what you want to achieve. Things can get complicated if your co-tenant either disappears or refuses to sign over their part of the lease. Try to get everything in writing. If you need at some time to go to the local court to recover money from a co-tenant, you'll need to show proof that you had an agreement that the money is owed and that it hasn't been paid. If the tenant who hasn't paid their rent has left and you've decided to stay, the landlord is going to want you to cover the full rent until a new tenant moves in or the lease ends. If you don't do this, the landlord will ask you to leave because the rent hasn't been paid. You may want to try to find another tenant to sign the lease. This means that the new tenant will take over the rights and responsibilities of the tenant who has left. The change to the lease needs to be managed by the property manager and must have the landlord's permission. The landlord can't unreasonably refuse to allow a new tenant, but can refuse a whole new lease. But what about getting the unpaid rent back from the co-tenant who hasn't paid? You could try to come to an arrangement with the leaving tenant. It's always good to try to part ways on friendly terms. However, if the tenant refuses to pay the unpaid rent, you may be able to take the money out of their bond. When a tenant signs their lease over to someone else, the bond money paid by the new tenant is paid to the leaving tenant, so you may be able to get the unpaid rent from the new tenant's bond money. The bond held at the rental bond board will remain the same. However, the leaving tenant will either receive a reduced amount of bond money or none at all, depending on how much rent they owe, or if there is any damage they've caused. Remember that you'll need to get the leaving tenant to sign a transfer of tenants form or similar form, depending on what state you live in for the bond board. This means that the old tenant's name will be replaced with the new tenant. If the bond doesn't cover the unpaid rent, then you may have to lodge a claim at the local court. You'll need to be able to show that an agreement existed between the tenants about how much each person would pay and that the co-tenant didn't pay their rent. Going to a local court will cost you a small fee, for which you can ask the tenant to pay if your claim is successful. If you can't afford to cover the rent and you can't find someone to replace the tenant, you may need to end the lease. Before taking this step, it's a good idea to talk to your landlord. They may be able to help or to come to an arrangement with you. If your tenancy agreement was for a periodic term, then all co-tenants will need to give the landlord the right amount of notice in writing and move out. How much notice you must give depends on what state you live in. You can find out how much notice to give by talking to your landlord or property manager. Once the notice period is completed, this means that the lease will be ended for everyone. You only have to pay for any rent owed, and providing that you've paid your rent and haven't damaged the property, you can get your bond money back. However, if your tenancy is on a fixed term, the situation is more difficult. You have to pay rent while the lease still has your name on it. It's a good idea to explain the situation to the landlord and ask them to end the lease. They don't, however, have to do this, and you may be forced to end the lease agreement yourself. If this happens, you'll be responsible for any rent for the remaining time on the lease unless you go to the tribunal and they allow you to end the lease on the grounds of financial hardship. Also, if you have to end the lease, the landlord is required to try to limit their loss. This means that they must make a genuine attempt to find another tenant to rent the house to and make any amount you have to pay smaller. If your co-tenant hasn't left but is still not paying rent, you may want to ask them to leave and to try to find another co-tenant to sign the lease over to. However, if the tenant won't leave and won't pay their rent, then this is where things can get tricky. Help can vary between states, so if this happens, you might want to email us and ask for advice on what you can do. You may have been feeling uncomfortable in the house before one of your co-tenants stopped paying their rent, and now you've decided that you just want to leave. If this happens, you have several options. If you have a lease for a fixed term, you may be able to find someone to sign your lease over to. If you have a lease that rolls over, you can give your landlord and your other co-tenants notice that you intend to leave. Make sure that you provide the right amount of notice as required by your state. If you don't do this, you may have to pay rent until the date the law in your state says you can leave. If there is unpaid rent when you leave, you'll still be responsible for that rent. You'll also have to pay rent until the date that someone takes over your part of the lease or the lease ends. Everyone's lease and rental questions are different, and the law changes often. If you have a specific question about your housing arrangements, please send us an email. You can read more about the National Children's and Youth Law Centre and what we do at the web address provided. The information contained in this video is general and is not intended to be advice on any matter. If you have a specific question, please email us at the details given.